we need to start making more conscious material choices.
I set up an initiative called Make Fashion Circular.
It's a tsunami of change.
Hello and welcome to the DIF, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation's interactive online events series. I'm Libby Finch, I'm from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, and I'm going to be hosting this session on a circular built environment. And it's a topic that's actually really close to my heart because when I first joined the foundation 2 years ago, it was one of the very first things I started working on here. And I'm really happy to say that during that period, I've also been working closely with our two guests on this topic. So we have Richard Boyd from Arup, who is a senior engineer at Arup, and Arup are also the global knowledge partner for the built environment with the foundation. And we also have, dialing in from Denmark, Cora Pulsgaard, who is the head of innovation at GXN, and GXN is the innovation arm of the architecture firm 3XN. So thanks very much for being here, both of you. And to kick us off, Richard, it's a term that's banded about a fair amount, so it'd be really useful if you could just describe what we mean when we talk about the built environment.
Okay, well, I guess at its simplest, the built environment is everything that it's the cities and the infrastructure that powers those, the cities that we live in, the towns that we live in, and it operates on different scales. So for the purposes of our work with the foundation, we talk about 5 different scales. There's the component scale. We're talking about individual assemblies and systems and buildings. We're talking about furniture. We're talking about other pieces of equipment. There's the building scale themselves, and buildings, of course, last anything from sort of 6 months to many centuries. There are infrastructure systems which connect buildings together and help form our cities, and those systems are sort of transport, water, energy, waste management, and communications. And then there's a district level, so when you're talking about neighborhoods and districts and whole cities as well. And finally, there's sort of a national economy scale when the cities come together and you have inter-city kind of infrastructure connections as well.
Great, but for this session today, because obviously that would be quite a lot to cover in one session, and we're talking around building a positive business case for built environment practitioners. What particular scale are we going to be?
So for the purposes of today, we're talking about buildings and we're talking about real estate. So buildings are things that we obviously sort of design, live, work, play, do various other things in, and real estate, I guess, is the set of businesses and the finances and the economics around buildings and cities. And so when we're talking about the business case for circular economy in the built environment, when we think about buildings, we also need to think about real estate.
Perfect, brilliant. And Cora, who is somewhere on the screen, hopefully. Yes, Cora, so just to bring you in, head of innovation, it's a really interesting title. And it would just be really interesting to learn a bit more about that before we get into the nitty-gritty of this session.
Sure. So as you said, we are the research arm of 3XN Architects. So we are architects, but we're also researchers. And I myself, actually, I'm an anthropologist, and that might color my way of viewing the problem in front of us. But basically what we do in GXN is that we do architectural research. So we're looking at some of the challenges we think are going to face our industry and going to face the built environment, and then try and figure out, how can we solve these? So we get to do all the stuff that architects don't really get to do day to day. We get to be the geeks. We get to be excited about new technology, try out stuff we don't know works, see if it works. If it doesn't, learn from our failures. We also get to ask open-ended questions, questions we don't know how to answer, and we get to work with a lot of different partners. And I think that's probably one of the key things in our approach is that we believe that some of the challenges we're facing are too big to solve alone. So we need to solve them in collaborative partnerships, working with you guys, working with Arup, working with everybody else who might hold a piece of the puzzle.
Brilliant. Great. Okay. Well, let's get into it then. So, Richard, built environment. What is the problem that we're trying to solve with our built environment, our buildings, and our real estate?
Okay. So at the minute, the built environment globally is facing sort of 2 or 3 real sort of mega trends that are going to transform the cities and the way that we live in cities in the future. The first is rapid urbanization. So between now and 2050, the urban population of the world is set to grow by about 2.4 billion people. The growth of the built environment required to accommodate those new inhabitants is going to drive significant growth in material demand. So by 2050, we expect demand for steel to double. We expect demand for cement to grow by up to 76%. To put that in sort of slightly more real terms, that growth, that amount of floor space is equivalent to 1 billion homes. That floor space is equivalent to a new New York City every 35 days for 30 years. Wow. So we're talking about a huge amount of growth, a huge amount of activity. But most of that growth is going to take place in lower middle income countries in the developing world, particularly sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. Here in the high income world, in places like the UK, we face a slightly different challenge. So London as a city is facing accommodating an extra 2.4 million people by 2041 with already existing sort of legacy, potentially low performance infrastructure. So about 87% of the buildings that will be standing in London in 2050 have already been built. And at the same time as these two big trends, sort of one of aging infrastructure, one of rapid urbanization, they're both playing out against the imperative to decarbonize our economy to achieve a net zero carbon built environment. And that's something that we're more and more aware of at the moment and is really sort of top of mind, top of agenda for lots of people here. So these three challenges taken together makes it clear to me and the work that I'm doing at Arup that we need new ways to design the built environment. And for us, circular economy and the ideas and the principles of a circular economy provide us both the tool and the inspiration for finding those new ways of delivering buildings and real estate.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay. Cora, so we know then from Richard's really helpful kind of introduction there about some of these major mega trends that are really affecting the industry. We know that there's some pretty serious problems here, but you'd have thought that, that would be sort of an obvious motivation for the industry to change and we talked about the need for collaboration, but what is it really that's preventing that industry from responding in the right way at the moment?
Sure. I mean, just to pick up on some of the trends Richard was mentioning, the numbers are completely mind-blowing. And the first part of that is really just making sure that everybody understands that the built environment is really a key piece of the puzzle. So the built environment in Denmark is creating 38% of society's waste and using 35% of society's resources and using 40% or is doing 40% of our carbon emissions. So, there's a lot of stuff to start working on. So some of the challenges that we're facing in the built environment are the complexity that we have. So buildings are becoming more complex. The products that we use in buildings are becoming more complex. The processes we use to put them together are becoming more complex. And that means what we're having is basically silos of competence and knowledge where knowledge and information doesn't travel too well across these. So again, we're facing challenges that we need to collaborate to solve, but at the same time, we have a complexity that fragments the industry and fragments knowledge within the industry. That is then compounded by the way the industry processes are organized. So if we look at the way a sort of regular tender process works, it kind of plays companies out against each other within their specific piece of the puzzle, usually only competing on price, which is the cost of construction rather than sort of a long-term price, which touches on the last sort of problem, which is about the incentives. So what incentives do we have to factor in long-term savings for the environment? At the moment, not very many. Investors and developers like projects with short-term payback periods and low risk. And I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. They're managing my pensions as well. But basically what we need to show in order to scale up circular economy is one, we need to show that there are short-term benefits and we can actually use circular economy to de-risk projects. And two, we need to find new ways and new models of pricing in medium-term to long-term benefits and revenues from projects so that we can help the decision makers make the right decisions up front.
Yeah, so is it fair to say then that there are some kind of fairly systemic kind of barriers that even if there's a willingness to change, and people see the motivation for changing actually because the whole industry is built around these kind of very sort of complex silos, and it actually is just really hard to do that at the moment? Or do you think it's because you don't see that willingness to change yet?
In my own experience, I believe everybody is understanding and is aware of the problem. And we can also see that there's now social pressures and growing political pressures for us to change. So I don't think many people in the industry are looking at the world right now and not thinking that we need to change how we work. So I think the question is more figuring out how can we create new models that allow us to work better together and allow us to incentivize the right choices in ways that makes it easier to actually make them. I'm very sure that most people in the industry know we have to change and are keen to find ways of changing. It's just a question of going from that top level awareness to day-to-day choice making.
Yeah. Okay. And so, Richard, that's something obviously that Arup also recognise and have partnered with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation on, because we see the circular economy as the framework to be able to start working out how to break down some of these barriers and create that sort of platform for change. So can you just tell us a bit about then what the research is that we've been working on around that and kind of building up those different business models that Cora was referring to?
Yeah, so together for the past 2 years or so, we've been working on a project called Principles to Practices. And that's been explicitly trying to take the principles of a circular economy, clearly articulated by the foundation, and apply them and translate them into everyday built environment practices. So things that really tangible changes that built environment practitioners can make in their day-to-day jobs. So that project has sort of, over its course, looked sort of at very broadly around Europe in 5 different cities and interviewed over 100 different stakeholders across the built environment value chain, from investors and reinvestment trusts at one end through to the demolition industry and the end-of-life industry at the other. And what came really clearly out of that sort of initial exploration exercise was there needs to be a clearer articulation of the business case for real estate people, for investors, and for construction clients. Because as Cora has mentioned, we're confident we know people would like to change. They just need to be able to make the case and demonstrate there are short-term as well as long-term benefits to changing. So we've been focusing on trying to create business models, that realize value in new ways using circular economy principles. Those models have sought to create value by first identifying where value is lost within the existing real estate value chain. And there are 5 areas of lost value that we've identified, which I think we can look at the screen and bring those up. The first of those is flexible spaces, underutilized space. So we know from earlier work by the foundation and Growth Within that up to 35 to 40% of European office space is underutilized even during office hours. So we know that we're building all this space, but then we're not using it particularly well. So we need to change how we access that space to make better use of it. We also know that a lot of buildings are demolished what we would call prematurely. So designers notionally have a sense or an idea of a 60-year design life. Structural designers have an idea of 60-year design life. And we know that increasingly the trend is for buildings to be demolished significantly younger than that. Some are demolished before their 20th birthday, many are demolished before their 30th birthday. So we need to sort of understand why buildings are being demolished and make them last longer. We also know there's a huge amount of land that could be developed, that could be brought forward to provide social value, but which isn't. It's currently lying derelict. And derelict land brings urban blight, and that's a negative impact. So we want to be able to find a way of increasing the speed or bringing forward developments and buildings on otherwise empty land.
Yeah, so not greenfield, but sort of brownfield, like land that has been developed on before, but now is vacant.
Yes, exactly. The fourth area, of course, comes back to materials. So building materials, when they reach their sort of notional end of life, their expected end of life, they've been depreciated on balance sheets, so they have, on paper, zero value. And we know core to circular economy is the idea of keeping materials and assets at their highest possible value for as long as possible. So if we're going to get to a circular economy in the built environment, we really need to address that challenge head on. And the final point, which coming from a design background in construction and is very aware to me and my colleagues in Arup, is this idea that buildings do not perform as they have been designed. So it's referred to as the performance gap. So on paper, your building looks like it will use X amount of energy, but actually in real life, it might be using 50% more than that, even twice as much as that. And so there's a clear need to change the incentives or change the way that we deliver so that buildings are actually delivering or performing as they've been intended to.
Great. So those are the areas where you thought, that there's potential to recover that kind of lost value through different ways of working.
Yep, so we've developed, mapping almost directly to those, we've developed 5 business models, 5 ways of realizing value in real estate that sort of eliminates that waste, tries to recapture that lost value. The first is flexible spaces, so kind of does what it says on the tin. You take a space that might be underutilized during the day, that might be, think of an office space that is unused in the morning, unused in the evenings. How do we, in an otherwise inflexible leasing arrangement, make that space available to people who would be able to use it and realize the value, realize the cash flows from those spaces? So that's number 1. Number 2 is adaptable assets. So this is an idea that assets, that buildings can be designed for multiple uses. If we get the structure and the skin of the building right, if an investor buys into that for the long term, then the function, this function-specific parts of a building, the bits of the building that make it an office building or make it a hotel or make it an apartment building, can be delivered on a shorter-term basis by a building operator, someone else who comes in and fits that out. And that means if society's needs change, if technology changes, and whatever you put in the building first time around becomes obsolete, you're able to upgrade the building, you're able to adapt it to the new circumstances without having to demolish it. And that helps us make sure that the core parts of our building, the steel, the cement, the high impact materials, are able to last longer. Of course, not every building will last forever, depending on the site, depending on the use. Buildings will, of course, eventually have to come down. And so we're looking at relocatable buildings, buildings that can be deconstructed. And specifically, we're looking at relocatable buildings in the case of vacant land. So can we put buildings onto sites that give us space that we can use, that offer value to the local communities much more quickly and much more agilely than the traditional regeneration project, development project. We're looking at some big urban sites in Milan or in London that are going to be built out over 10, 20 years. In the meantime, that land is lying empty. So what can we do to help address some of the pressing social needs we have with relocatable buildings? So we put a building up, but we don't create waste, because once we don't need it anymore, we move it somewhere else. The fourth model is trying to tackle this question of residual value of materials. How do we incentivize a construction client or an investor at the beginning of a project to pay what might be a little bit more, at least initially while it matures, to make sure that those buildings are recoverable at their end of life, so that they are designed for deconstruction so that they can go on and have subsequent second, third, fourth lives. And here we're looking at a financial instrument that could be sold by the developer at the beginning to raise that cash flow, to make that initial investment feasible for them. But the value of that financial instrument is then tied to the value of the materials when they come out. And we don't have to be talking about super long periods, because different layers of a building there's an American architect, Stuart Brand, talked about layers of a building. Buildings change at different speeds over their life. The finishes, the carpets, the furniture, the partitions, they might only last 7, 10 years before they're changed. The facade might be replaced, the skin of the building might be replaced every 20, 30 years. The MEP systems, the lighting, the ventilation might be replaced every 15, 20 years. So we're talking about material streams, flows coming in and out of buildings throughout its life. And each time some material comes out, that initial investor realizes the value of those materials and is able to sort of get their return on that initial financial product at that moment in time. And the final model is space as a service. So this is taking the sort of well understood idea of product as a service as a business model for circular economy thinking, and trying to apply it to whole spaces within buildings. How do I pay for performance rather than paying for stuff? I want to buy lighting. I don't want to buy light bulbs. And that's looking really at the sort of, again, the energy using systems, lifts, escalators, heating and cooling, ventilation, but also the partitions and the internal space plan. You know, if I'm changing a building around for a new occupant, new tenant, how do I pay a subscription for that product rather than owning it?
Yeah.
And it makes sense because, from a circular economy point of view, because if I pay a subscription and that service is provided to me by a supplier, so I'm paying only for what I get, that means they're incentivized financially to create a system that will last a long time, create a system that will perform at its highest possible performance for a long time. And also, it will actually perform as it was designed. So then that incentive is directly created to make sure that that performance gap I talked about earlier is closed.
Yeah. And what's interesting about this is that some of them, you know, you can see elements of already, you know, in the way that we run and operate and design buildings. And some of them are really quite new and aren't available. You know, they're not market options at the moment. So yeah, that's a kind of timeline, isn't it, of things that we can start doing now, but also things that need a bit of a shift to get going.
We've seen, I mentioned some of the mega trends earlier, but we're also seeing like more fast-paced, more local trends coming in. You know, I mean, WeWork is an interesting example. It's certainly, you know, it was the poster boy for flexible office space. It's had sort of more challenging headlines more recently, but you know, we see flexible office space as the new norm for many businesses. You don't want to take a 20-year lease on a space when you don't know how much space you're going to need. So why make that commitment? There's clear value to businesses to occupying space in a more agile way that responds to their business's needs as they grow, as they shrink, as they respond to the market. So this sort of flexible spaces is kind of already coming. In adaptable assets, we've got infrastructure operators already trying to make these distinctions between I want to invest in something that has a long-term, reasonably guaranteed payback, 25, 30 years in the case of infrastructure projects. But a specific operator that might be doing something a little bit more short-term is contractually separate from that arrangement. So then you're able to adapt if the market changes within that 30-year period, and so on for the other three. But all of them are currently sort of enabled and facilitated by digital technology. Yeah. So there are good reasons almost why it made economic sense to build the built environment the way we have done. It's not that this is, you know, we've been getting it wrong all this time, but for circular economy to really be made to happen in our sector, we need new capabilities and we need to do things differently. And digital technology gives us the ability to do things differently. Yeah. It gives us the ability through Internet of Things to monitor the performance of building systems in real time. I know how much energy my lights are using. I know when users are demanding light. I know when users are demanding heat. We see smart thermostats like Nest in places. We've seen remote sensing, individually controlled lamps coming in, all controlled through Wi-Fi and radio, and using machine learning algorithms to adapt those systems to how users actually use their buildings. And so if we're looking to pay by performance and we're able to record performance in real time, then that's how that is made to happen.
Brilliant. Thank you. That really sort of well describes the models, and I think we'll probably come back to them in a bit because I can see some questions coming in about them. But I just want to go back to Cora now and just bring Cora in, because what is really strikes you when Richard was talking us through those is it is definitely a different way of doing business. Whereas I think a lot of the conversation around buildings has been about kind of design strategies. So we've heard a lot about designing for disassembly and focusing on material efficiency and things. So I'd be interested to hear from your point of view when you've been talking about these new ways of doing business. How has that landed with your clients, and have you had those sorts of conversations yet?
So we have some projects where we have had these conversations and have actually been implementing some of the tools we can use to achieve these. So I think the first thing to say from a design perspective about these business models, whether it's flexible space, adaptable assets, temporary buildings, or residual value, is that it requires a new way of designing and constructing our buildings for us to be able to actually go out and harvest the value potential that is in here. So from us, from a design perspective, that's really what we're focusing on. So we believe that the best possibility for actually making a circular building is in the design phase. This is where we got to get a lot of choices right. We got to make sure that we prepare the buildings for these future business models that we want to put in. So for us, we've been working with this for a long time. We've just put out a third edition of our sort of manual on this. And this really explains which sort of overall tools we are looking at. So for us, we're specifically looking at design for disassembly. So very simple question, how do we design our buildings in ways that means we can take them apart and use the components again? Right now, we are basically putting buildings together with a lot of adhesives, concrete, glues and binders, which means that we can't really take the components apart and everything is crushed and really loses value, and we need to create new products and components. So if we can design the building smarter, we can actually take the components apart and we can reuse them, resell the materials, or use them to create more flexible buildings where we can move stuff around. So that's really the first strategy that we're using. We're also looking into the notion of material passports. So as Richard was saying, in London, in Copenhagen, in these cities, a large part of the built environment that will be here in 30 years is already here. The big challenge is we have no idea what's in there. We don't know we don't know how many materials. We don't know the level of poisonous materials. Things that we would be using in the 70s now know that we shouldn't be using anymore. We don't know the state of the materials. So when we talk about circular economy from a design perspective, we're really looking at two challenges. One is what do we do with the buildings we already have? Another one is how do we design for what we're going to have in the future? And for the last thing, the other big thing besides design for disassembly is material passports. We want to make sure that in the future we know what's in the built environment. We want to know what's in the buildings. So we look at ways we can track the materials and track their health through the lifetime, so that information can actually enable a market for secondary materials, or enable a portfolio owner to see what buildings they have and how they might be adapted in case they need that. And then the last thing we're looking at in the book and increasingly in real life projects is the economy side of circular economy. This needs to make business sense. So in the book, we're working with quite a few partners in Copenhagen, and one of our construction partners did a calculated business case. So this was a case where we took a 3XN design building. It was 40,000 square meters, and we're looking, saying, if we implement all the best practices that we know for circular economy, what would that mean for the business case once this building is at its end of its life? So implementing design for disassembly, keeping track of the materials, finding out how we could take care of the materials over the lifetime. So do operations in ways that we retain the value of the materials in the different life cycles that Richard was talking about. And so what the calculated business case showed was that we were able to turn a demolition downsides of about 2 million euro to a sort of an upside of, I think it's about 8 million euro. So, the business case was sound. We've then been out since during the Principles to Practice project to talk to different stakeholders in the built environment. And what we found was that even though this is an interesting business case, this doesn't really chime well with the incentives and the models we talked about before. It's too long term at the moment. So what we've been trying to do then is figure out how can we start working in and demonstrating value in the short term. And so we have two projects I would like to share where we sort of tried these things out and can document that. So if I can just share my screen real quickly.
So these are projects that you've worked on at GXN and 3XN?
Yes.
Great.
And with quite a big group of partners, I should say. But let me just share, and I can show you. You should see my screen now.
There we go. Technology's working. Excellent.
Okay, it's great. So this is the first project. This is this is not the full Circle House, but this is a demonstrator for a project called Circle House. So these are 60 housing units that we're building in Aarhus here in Denmark. So this is a demonstration project. It was supported by the Danish EPA and a Danish foundation called Realdania. And the task was to build these 60 housing units for a public housing provider, so that it had to be really price efficient. So what we did for this project was basically get the full value chain together. We created a communal design studio consisting of 3XN, GXN, and Linear Architects and Bandkunsten, two other Copenhagen-based architecture companies. And that design studio worked through the different life cycles of the different parts of the building, so superstructure, foundations, everything else. The goal for the project is that 90% of all the materials can be reused without significant loss of value. So this means we got to implement design for disassembly at all scales. To do that, we then worked with partners across the built environment here in Denmark. I think we brought in 35, I think it's now 40 partners for the project, basically looking at the products that are already out there, the different ways of working, the processes, what can we take from them that works, and then adapt them to become more circular. We didn't want to invent a whole new system here that wouldn't have a chance of standing on its own 2 feet afterwards. We wanted to work with the built environment to actually create change and show the companies we're working with that they can have a business model doing this. And so in terms of demonstrating value, one of the things that this project does is it developed a simplified construction system for these houses. It's simplified in terms of the components that form part of it, but also in the fittings and connections. So usually if you're doing precast concrete, you're going to be pouring concrete or cement into all the fittings and then wait for that to cure before you can build on. Here we're using mechanical fittings that are reversible. So these fittings are basically working a little bit like large-scale IKEA. They're created with these sort of screws and nuts and bolts system rather than cement. And what that did was, once this demonstrator that I'm showing here was built, they managed to put this up in a morning, basically. So we managed to shave about 10% of the construction time off. These are numbers from the construction company, basically using 15 minutes per piece, per wall piece they're putting up. So this is time saved on site that we think we can then translate into the large project once we're doing that. And time saved on site means money saved and risk mitigated. So this is going to be very interesting once we build this to see how that flies. At another scale, I'd like to show you the Key Quarter Tower in Sydney. So this is a sort of shining tower that you can see in Sydney's central business district here. This is a project won by 3XN Architects. The site where this tower is going to be built already had an existing building on it. And so the city of Sydney was keen to incentivize the client to reuse parts of the old building. And so what the architects did, working with the client, working with the city, was figuring out how we could reuse as much of the building as possible. So basically the incentive was the more you can reuse, the more square meters you're going to add to the site. And so what we did is simply sort of take away the front end of the existing tower, retaining 98% of the structural walls and 65% of beams, slabs, and columns, and then using that superstructure from the existing tower to add the new tower around, and thereby add more square meters and give this a more sort of up-to-date design language. I think there's an interesting point here is that there's a lot of the buildings that we have standing around that are at their end of their design life, meaning, you know, they are not they're not aspirational anymore. The design is not up to scratch. People are not keen on living in them, but the materials in them are not necessarily at the end of their life. And so if we can find ways of updating the design while reusing, keeping the materials, I think there's first of all a good business case, but also a great case for really reducing the impact of the built environment. But here we managed to reuse quite a large part of the existing tower. We also build in, so part of the tower is creating these smaller spaces. So rather than just have the same floor plate all the way up, we create these 5-stack volumes with big atriums in between to give people views of each other and get sunlight into the building. The client wasn't sure that their tenants necessarily were keen on atriums, so we also build in these removable platforms, so basically building flexibility into the tower so that the atriums can be closed off or open depending on tenant wishes. So what this did in terms of CO2 is that we managed to save 7,500 tons of CO2. These are numbers calculated by a Sydney-based research unit from the existing material. So there's a good carbon case to be had here. There's also a good value case. So retaining a large part of the existing tower means that we save 80 million euros. these numbers on the screen are Australian dollars, so that translates to roughly 80 million euros. And this is obviously in materials, but it's also in time saved. Again, less time having a demolition site and all the infrastructure around that, and a construction site in the middle of the central business district of Sydney is a significant cost saver. So these are sort of two projects where we managed to save money for the client, to add value to the city, and to reduce the carbon footprint by using these strategies within the different frames of the projects.
Great.
I'm gonna go back from sharing here just a second.
Thanks very much, Cora. So I've got quite a few questions that I want to pose to you both about both of those presentations. But first, I think we're going to hear from Stella about what's coming up next in the diff.
Hi, I'm Stella, and here are a couple of recommendations for what's coming up next in the diff. First up, we've got Decommissioning Old Platforms, a reuse story. In this session, we'll be exploring how the UK's oil platforms could be decommissioned and why this could be an opportunity to capture as much economic value as possible. Then, turning off the tap, how the 12 hours of zero waste can end system overload. In this session, the participants will explore new ideas and opportunities to tackle the system overload and create real system change. And remember, you can join the conversation by using the hashtag ThinkDiff on Twitter. You can also catch up on anything you've missed and view the full schedule at thinkdiff.co or on the Ellen MacArthur Foundation's YouTube channel. Happy watching!
Great. Okay. Well, back here in the studio, we're talking to Richard Boyd from Arup and Cora Poulsgaard from GXN. We're talking about the building a positive business case, and we've just had some examples from Cora around sort of two projects that they've worked on, which have ended up proving that money can be saved, carbon emissions can be saved. It's a win-win. But I guess the question is, those are isolated examples. How are we really going to scale this, and who are the stakeholders that we need to really get on board to make that happen?
So it comes back, I think, to the business case. So we have taken each of those 5 models I talked through, and we've applied them to each one to one of 5 testbed projects. These are real projects being pursued by real clients across 5 cities in Europe. One's in London, one's in Milan, one's in Amsterdam, one's in Berlin, and one is in Aarhus in Denmark. And what we've done is that we've reimagined those projects using our models, and we are doing a financial analysis on the improvement in investment value. What is the better business case for each of those projects if it had considered our circular economy business models from the beginning?
This is basically because at the moment you see the key stakeholders, investors, clients, they basically don't believe that there is a business case. Is that what it is? Have you had that direct feedback?
I think there's just an ambivalence. I think there's as Cora said, there's a willingness to believe there is a business case. There's just these are financially numbers-minded people, and so by creating these test cases and running some feasibility level numbers on it and articulating in terms of an improved internal return on investment or rate of return or a reduction in cost, we can sort of put in cold hard cash the beneficial impact on the bottom line for adopting circular economy principles in this sector. And what we're hoping that will do, or what we're looking to do with those results, is disseminate them to the real estate investment and the construction client communities, because we know that increasingly this community is concerned about their carbon footprint. We've mentioned some of the emissions statistics already, but the key materials for the built environment, steel contributes 5% of global CO2 emissions. Cement contributes about 7 to 8 of global CO2 emissions. Put that in context, global aviation as a whole is only 2%. So we're really talking about huge climate footprint. So if we can bring a set of business models to clients that help them achieve their net zero carbon objectives and also improves their bottom line and delivers an improved business case for the projects, I think we can really start to see a case that could be like really compelling for these stakeholders. What do we want them to do with it? Well, we want them to start to apply it at commercial scale on real projects. We've seen plenty of pilots and demonstrators. Arup delivered the circular building at the London Design Festival. That was an installation that was up for 3 weeks, designed around returning materials to the supply chain in the condition that they were received in. We've seen an increasing number of retrofit projects like 3XN's tower in Sydney, like One Triton Square with British Land in London, that are sort of delivering market-leading spaces, really competitive letting rates and rents, but on like a fraction of the carbon footprint or a fraction of the material footprint of what a new build would have been. So we want to say, let's start to apply it not just on individual projects. Well, let's start to pilot it first. Let's pilot it on real projects, demonstrate that business case, demonstrate the evidence base for that this can really be achieved on real projects, iron out any of the issues, and there will be issues, but we can work together through collaboration to innovate. Cora's mentioned the kind of network that they are using on Circle House to sort of work out problems together collectively, and we just need to demonstrate that it'll work.
Great. On that, we've had a comment in from the audience about the space as a service model, which is basically, isn't that just the argument for renting, which doesn't always work well, and how, what makes this different, and how would you convince someone to apply that?
Yeah, so I think there's leasing or renting is it's an existing business model in large parts of the built environment, and commercial directors in the built environment, be they in real estate businesses or in contractors, they understand the situations where they will own, they understand the situations where they will lease. I think what is really key and different about our space as a service model is this idea of you're not just leasing it, you're paying for a different service. You're not paying for ownership of a system. If you're leasing for something that's essentially temporary ownership, you're responsible for it, you do have to give it back. What you're paying for is performance. And so you're incentivizing the supply chain to deliver you a different product that performs better and lasts longer. And it helps to eliminate some of these barriers that we mentioned around the performance gap. And it also,
Does that mean your subscription rate is based on an agreed level of performance? As in, is that one way it could work? So you'd sort of agree on a contract basis that this is the level of performance that you're paying for. If performance goes below that, would you get a discount? And if it goes above that, do they?
So we're increasingly seeing in infrastructure projects as well, the contracts that are being used there have pain gain sharing mechanisms built into them. So at the minute, a lot of the risk for anything new is borne by clients, and understandably, clients do not want to be on the hook for cost rises, on the hook for delays. Yeah. And so there are contract mechanisms already written up, proven in action on projects right now that allow that sharing of positives and negatives to be delivered in a way that creates win-win situations for everyone. What we haven't really seen at scale yet is the application of those to the operation of buildings. We have design, build, operate, maintain contracts, very popular on the continent at the minute. They were known as PFI in the UK, which in its first iteration caused some problems and has been looked at again at the minute. But what we do want to see is people paying for performance, incentivizing everyone through the value chain, from contractors to designers to suppliers and building operators, to work together to deliver sort of the longest lasting, best performing system for clients and users.
Brilliant. And I just want to bring Cora back in because Cora, I'm interested as you've obviously been part of the conversation around building these new business models, and you have clearly been delivering projects that kind of work around the similar themes. But from your point of view, like going into a meeting room to sort of suggest this to a client, like what is the key thing that you think will win them over? Is it that the bottom line, the financial line, or is it the whole story around the environmental value and the social value that comes with it as well? What is the real sticking point?
If I could give you just one, I mean, I'm not particularly keen on doing that. I think you gotta have that larger case behind you when you're coming in with this. But I think in terms of having a conversation with the client, I think what we need is actually having a closer conversation. I think there's still a gap for us in terms of understanding developers and investors, understanding which projects this might fit for. So one thing we got to be aware is that basically in the built environment you have large amounts of money. There are very long time scales, and there's a high degree of, as I said before, complexity, stuff you don't know, things will go wrong, and risks scale quickly within this environment, right? So understanding and having a dialogue with different types of investors for specific projects, understanding, for this specific project, what's the risk profile you're willing to go in? What's the payback periods? What are the business models you're looking at? And then being able to tailor make the solutions. I don't think there's going to be a one size fits all. I think it's going to be very project based. And so what I think is really needed is more of a conversation with the client around these things. And to back that conversation up, I think it's great to have the calculated cases, have the projects, being able to show that it works. I think that's an absolute key. So what we need to be able to do better from the architect's point of view is documenting value creation. We got to be able to show that we did this and they created this value for this specific project. Our solution could solve this for you and turn a problem into this sort of feature for your project or whatever it is. But we need to be able to have the documentation and through that documentation have a conversation where we understand the needs of the specific project and the specific client better. So I think it's really a question of trying to bring people around the table in a different way. And I think so that's why I'm saying we also need that larger story. I think what we're going to be seeing is larger pressures coming in. Richard's example of WeWork kind of changing expectations to office environments is pretty good, right? It used to be that if you're a real estate developer doing offices, you just put that risk onto the client. Refurb, that's you. You take the lease out for 20 years. If you want to change anything, that's your problem. You got to pay for that. WeWork changed that expectations within a very, very short time frame, meaning that most developers are now working, looking at ways of meeting those expectations. So expectations change quickly. We're seeing a lot of attention around our general ways of living, building, working, and how that impacts the climate and how that impacts the planet. So I think we're going to see changing expectations, and I think we're going to see those changing expectations come in new building codes and new laws. And I think the most forward-thinking companies should start looking at this now because it's moving faster than we think. In Denmark, we have a new government come in half a year ago. They upped the sort of the goal. So we want to do in Denmark now a 70% reduction in emissions by 2030. So that's in 10 years. We don't know what codes they're going to come out with to achieve that goal, but if they're serious about that ambition, it's going to change how we do things. We're going to have to introduce new standards, new building codes, and the people who are sort of moving first on this can reap the benefits rather than sort of be thrown under the bus once the change comes. So I think that's the burning platform that we can use to initialize the conversation and then have the conversation around a specific project using these value cases to show that it actually works.
Yeah.
So just to sort of quickly come in on that, I think Cora mentioned a few times, he talked about people and getting people in a room, and I think one of the themes that comes out of this is that while we can talk a lot about materials and we can talk a lot about principles and we talk a lot about carbon, because we obviously that imperative is there to achieve net zero or 70% or net zero carbon by 2030. What really drives this is the delivery of social value for communities. So you're delivering for people in the organizational sense, you're motivating people, you're involving them, you're engaging them. So there's like a personal, individual connection. But also we need to deliver better services and better experiences and healthier experiences for people. And if we're not improving natural well-being, if we're not improving the well-being of communities and people, then we're not changing the right things. So WeWork changed things rapidly because they were able to offer office occupants like a significantly better, more personalized, more responsive environment. They did that potentially in quite a dynamic and exciting when we need to be able to sort of say circular economy is not just about the bottom line and cash. It's not just about carbon, but it's also about giving better services. It's got to outcompete the existing system. It's got to be better for their health, and it's got to be better for nature as well.
Yeah, and that point that Cora made as well about it's not a one size fits all, and that equally applies to the fact that these models need to be applicable in a whole variety of geographical locations, a whole variety of building typologies, and we had a question that came in from Sophie that was about how does your company cope with the current local city construction laws and local permissions. So that point around even if you have these overarching principles, they need to be adaptable to different local environments and situations, and policy is clearly one as well that Cora talked about.
So we've been having sort of an ongoing discussion, particularly in London, around the incoming requirements in the London Plan. The new London Plan is coming into force early next year, and that requires developments above a certain size to write a circular economy statement. And that circular economy statement is a planning requirement that all projects will deliver to the GLA, the Greater London Authority, that explains how circular economy principles have been included in their project. So while some regulations and local building codes are going to be a hindrance to the adoption of circular economy, and we need to bring policymakers into that conversation so they understand what the hindrance is and how we can design a win-win, keep the protection that it's offering, but also allow circular economy to accelerate. We're also seeing some authorities really starting to drive it by implementing policies that almost require projects to consider some of the things we've been talking about.
Yeah.
So just picking up on that point from Richard, I think local authorities have a pretty, at least in the Danish context, I'm pretty sure it's the same in the UK. They have a chance now to take the lead and really start setting a demand for these solutions. What I think they probably need is now standardized ways of measuring this. So how do you measure circularity in a tender? How do you how do you know the house is designed for disassembly, these kind of problems. So what we're doing at the moment is we're working a lot with the Danish Standards Organization, who are now trying to pitch for developing shared European standards for some of these things, so that we can have some standardized ways of measuring circular performance that you can then actually put out to tender, and then have your different companies compete on, so that we have something that goes again across the different projects and can help the businesses and the companies out there then tailor-make their solutions to fit those needs.
Fantastic. That's great news. Well, I'm conscious that time is rolling on, and I think it would be really good, first of all, to hear how people can find out a bit more about some of the work that both your organisations are doing. So, Richard, I don't know if you want to just start and tell people, what's on the horizon there.
So, I referred to From Principles to Practices, the joint project between Arup and the MacArthur Foundation as part of our knowledge partnership. The first report from that was launched last year. It's available on both our websites. If you search for First Steps Towards a Circular Built Environment, you should be able to find that, and that will list out the insights that were generated from the interviews, the case study analysis that we did previously. In the next few months, we will be launching the second output of From Principles to Practices, which will be describing in more detail the models we've talked about today and releasing the positive investment cases that have been calculated for these testbed projects across those 5 cities. So keep it, eyes peeled, watch this space for the next installment from Principles to Practices.
Brilliant. And Cora, the weighty book that you
the weighty book. It's also available in a lot less weighty, but not less informative online edition. So if you go to buildingacircularfuture.com, you can download the book for free, and you can also download materials on Circle House. And you can go to our website, gxn.3xn.dk, and see more about our projects, and of course get in touch, and we'd be happy to share knowledge. That's basically part of what we do, and so everybody is free to get in touch with us, and we'll tell them more.
Brilliant. And I'm going to just a final question to you, Cora. I guess I'm interested in, like, change needs to happen now. I mean, change needed to happen yesterday. So how quickly, realistically, do you think the sort of transformations that we need to actually bring carbon targets in line with where they need to be, and all of those imperatives, how quickly do you think this industry could actually transform?
So I'm an optimist right now, and I'm an optimist because I can see what happened in the 4 years that I've been working with circular economy. So this has moved from very much being a technical challenge, how do we design things so we can take them apart, to then becoming an organizational challenge, but bottom up, looking at, who are the people we got to have around the table to solve this. What we're seeing now is a lot more demand coming top down from municipalities, from the Danish government, from the standards organizations, who are basically looking for ways to now implement this in policy. And I think that sort of top-down pressure is really going to move things. At the same time, that bottom-up creativity we're having is going to enable the companies to actually meet the demand. So for me, I'm an optimist. I think we're already seeing the first steps. I'm very interested in seeing what's going to happen in the next 5 years. Maybe we should have a session in about 5 years and see how we're going along.
Brilliant. Richard, do you agree? Are you that optimistic?
I hope we don't have to wait 5 years for our next session. No, I mean, we're seeing a huge amount, and I think, we have been working with C40 a lot, so that's the network of mayors around the world, 96 cities who are committed to taking climate action, and we're seeing a huge amount of action from them on material footprints and in the built environment, looking at how it can not just reduce emissions impacts, but also improve air quality, provide local jobs and that kind of thing. So I think like cities and city mayors and municipalities is a really exciting space right now. And I'm pretty excited that and pretty optimistic as well that change is coming and this is a moment.
Brilliant. Well, thanks very much both of you for joining. I hope that everyone who's been listening is equally optimistic after hearing of the great work that's going on and trying to really kickstart that circular built environment movement. So thanks very much for joining. Stay tuned for more DIF sessions coming up later.
We need to start making more conscious material choices.
Set up an initiative called Make Fashion Circular.
It's a tsunami of change.